So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Toni Schoenenberger. I'm the Executive Chairman of STARS. STARS is a global platform for dialogue to discuss developments which will impact the society as a whole, and particularly also our businesses in the next couple of years. Today, we are continuing our webinar series called "Is this the final end of Pax Americana? Implications for business and society?" No doubt, we are facing a multitude of disrupting phenomena, particularly in the area of geopolitics and geoeconomics. And no doubt, developments in the US are key for the world as a whole. Today, we have the great privilege to talk to Steven Okun. Steve, thank you very much for joining this session.
Great to be with you again.
Steven Okun is founder and CEO of APAC Advisors, a leader on corporate public affairs, ESG, sustainability, and stakeholder engagement. He is the immediate past chair of the AmChams of the Asia Pacific. He was elected for 3 times as chair of AmCham Singapore. Steve frequently appears on TV and other global media. And I'm very proud of it. He has been a speaker at the last STARS Singapore Symposium in June. Steve, so thank you very much again for joining this webinar. We are very much looking forward to your insights. We have now 30 minutes. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your questions. And I would like to encourage you to do it as fast as possible because we are running out of time very, very quickly. Now, let's start with the questions. Steve, on the US election, obviously, and I want to provoke you a little bit. I would say the result in November will be very clear. We shall see a Democratic landslide. Kamala Harris will be the next president by a huge margin. Would you agree to that?
Well, as a Democrat, as a official who served under President Clinton, as somebody who's worked in Democratic campaigns, I hope you're right. As a political analyst, I'd say way too soon to know. Look, the United States is just an extraordinarily divided country right now. In the 2016 election, you switch, 80,000 votes in 3 key states, and we have President Hillary Clinton, not President Donald Trump. And 4 years later, even closer, you switch 43,000 votes in 3 states, and Donald Trump would have gotten a second term. And there's no reason to believe that 2024 isn't going to come down to that relative handful of votes in a relative handful of states. Now, look, ever since, President Biden, did the historic and honorable thing and dropped out, and Vice President Harris became the nominee, she has been outperforming everyone's expectations. She is still in this incredible honeymoon. Usually a honeymoon in politics these days, you're lucky to have it last a day or two. It's been going on for weeks. It will come to an end. Maybe it'll be after the Democratic convention, and September, October rolls around, and we're going to be in a long slog up through election day as to who's going to win. And it really is a toss-up right now. As much as I hope you're right, Tony.
Okay, so let's leave it open, whoever wins the election. So I have a couple of other questions, obviously, Steve. So let's talk again about the US election and the impact of the elections. First question, what about on the likelihood of isolationism after the election next year?
Look, it is much more likely to have certainly strong elements of isolationism under an America First foreign policy that you would have under a second Trump administration than you would under a Harris administration. I mean, what the Harris, or I should say the Biden-Harris approach has been, and presumably the Harris-Walz approach will be, is one of working with partners and allies, building a lattice work in Asia. And it could be trade, it could be military, it could be economics, it could be development, and with all of these different partners you have here. So you would see that continue certainly under a Harris administration. You would see, in a way, the opposite. You'd see a return to strong elements of isolationism under an America First policy. In an America First policy, the view is that the U.S. is stronger when it negotiates bilaterally. When it has a bilateral relationship with anyone in the world, it has an advantage because the U.S. is the strongest military, the biggest economy, and that it can dictate what it wants much more so in a bilateral relationship. So you are going to see very different, a very large difference. It's going to be more impactful probably in Europe than it'll be in Asia, but you will certainly see a difference in Asia between these two administrations, and businesses need to prepare for both.
And what are you expecting regarding, let's call it trade wars, tariffs, sanctions?
More of the same, more of the same, more of the same, I think, on all of them. I think you'll see a different approach, certainly. I just was in Washington last month, meeting with Democrats, Republicans, the administration, the Hill, people from, the America First Policy Institute, Heritage Foundation, from the more center side as well. And there is agreement that there does need to be trade. The question is under what structures would it be? You would see under a Harris administration a continuation, for example, of IPEF. Certainly not a trade agreement like the TPP, but the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework does bring some structure for the U.S. to work plurilaterally with various countries. That would continue. That would not continue. President Trump has already said he'd be out of that on day one. So you'll have bilateral versus plurilateral, multilateral on trade. You will see some trade from both sides. If you want to be an optimist, the biggest opportunities we have are in sectoral agreements. And in particular, critical minerals is one. The United States recognizes it needs critical minerals. If it wants to build that infrastructure in the clean economy, you need critical minerals agreements to do that. So sectoral approach. Digital, harder, a little bit more contentious in the U.S. right now with varying parties, but you could see a sectoral agreement on digital trade as well. So there is some opportunity to move forward. Nothing like coming back to TPP, nothing like probably even having those type of FTAs that the U.S. is built on in Asia.
And regarding technology competition, could you deepen that point a little bit?
Well, and the technology competition, that is where you see a lot of similarities between the Biden approach and the Trump approach. And you certainly see that we have a shift in how you view trade and what is permitted in terms of investment, what is permitted in terms of trade. And we've gone away from a national security lens on prohibiting certain things. And obviously, if it had military use, you weren't going to be able to sell that into China. If it was dual use, you wouldn't be able to sell that into China. And we've gone away from that lens into somewhat of more of a sectoral lens in technology, especially when it comes to AI, if it comes to biotech, when it comes to clean tech, all of those things are going to start to get restricted by any U.S. administration. And that's because the view of China from the U.S. perspective has changed. We are never going to go back to that period of, engage with China and accommodate their rise. That which lasted, you can argue from Carter, through Obama, the beginning of the Obama administration, that's over. China is either viewed as a competitor. Some people in the U.S., when I was meeting with them, use the term enemy, which I push back on. But that's where the view is, and technology is at the center of that competition, be it with them as a competitor or as an enemy.
And how do you see the impact on sustainability, on climate, on human rights?
Well, let's do human rights because I think that's more of again where there's a lot of consensus between Democrats, Republicans, America First versus a work with partners and allies approach. The types of using law, using trade to protect human rights is only going to continue. You certainly saw it with the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, where the U.S. has found that if not an outright genocide, there's that type of activity occurring against the Uyghurs, and that there's going to be a presumption that any goods manufactured out of that province are going to be made with forced labor, and it's very hard to overcome that presumption. So you could see more laws like that. You certainly saw them apply in Hong Kong. You can see more of that applying, and not just against China. I think human rights and forced labor in the supply chain, which is a terrible issue in Southeast Asia. A lot of the plantations and the manufacturing in Southeast Asia rely upon forced labor, and you're going to see maybe even more of a focus under President Harris if she were to win. But you'll see it under both. Human rights, you could certainly see moving in one direction. Sustainability is going to be a tougher call because you do have that competing interest under Harris approach, which would be we have to address the climate crisis, but we need to work with China to help us do that. Whereas a Trump approach might be very different and have less trade and taking into account climate change.
Steve, you're based in Singapore, Asia, the Asia-Pacific region very, very well. What will be the impact next year on the US policy vis-a-vis Asia in general?
Yeah, well, look, the U.S. does have, it doesn't just have a China policy. I mean, China is part of the Asia policy. So you have to see where all that fits together. One of the interesting things that's happening right now is that there is a diversification out of China. And there's a diversification out of China, one, because of what was learned from COVID and from zero COVID in particular. You cannot put all your eggs in one supply chain basket. You have to diversify out of China. Now, you overlay the geopolitical risk and the tensions between the US and China, and then that accelerates it even more. Now, that diversification out of China, that is not just US companies and Swiss companies and European companies diversifying out of China. That's Chinese companies diversifying out of China as well. And so you're having a massive amount of investment coming into Southeast Asia. You're having a massive amount of immigration coming into Southeast Asia. You're also having a flood of goods coming into Southeast Asia. And there's a lot of people grappling with that now. Because what happens when it comes, if you have a tariff on a good coming out of China, well, if you have a Chinese company that's owned by Chinese in Thailand, and that same good ships to the U.S., well, should that be subject to the same tariff? Is that a Chinese good? Historically, you'd say no, of course not. It's a Thai good. But is that going to change? What's going to happen to ownership? What's going to happen to tariffs? What's going to happen to sanctions? So all of this we're really at the beginning of trying to figure out. I broadly put it into it's not transshipments, but transshipments gives you the right frame of mind to think about what happens when you have all of these different flows. And you'll certainly see it. You're seeing it now come out in Mexico, where the Biden administration has put that 100% tariff on EVs coming out of China. Well, if BYD builds a factory in Mexico, is that a Chinese electric vehicle or is that a Mexican electric vehicle? And then what happens to the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, when it comes to rules of origin and determining all that? So it is going to be an exciting time when it comes to trade, when it comes to investment, when you see what's happening with the diversification out of China by everybody.
I have one question, then I will put it to you in a minute. But first of all, talking about China, could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on your perspective, on your thinking regarding Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean the U.S. policy, Taiwan's policy, and China's policy have all worked up to this point of course, and the U.S. policy has been let there be enough space so that the people in Taiwan and the government of China can figure out how this is going to work over time. And it has kept the peace across the straits. It is still being maintained right now, but it's pushing closer and closer to having some type of tension. And part of what we certainly are watching is, will the U.S. change its position under either President Harris or under President Trump when it comes to strategic ambiguity, that the U.S. will not make it clear if it would defend Taiwan if it were to be attacked, and what was the reason for such an attack to take place. So there's nervousness to see if this policy of the U.S. is going to maintain. The other thing that people are very nervous about is that the likelihood of an accident is increasing with the amount of activity that's occurring, with the number of incursions into airspace that take place, with the number of operations that are ongoing. And can we make certain that there is no escalation of what was an accident and was never intended, and then to scale into something catastrophic? So certainly businesses now have got to be prepared for what would happen if there was military action in the Straits. Doesn't matter why it started, but once it gets going, you have to be worried about your people. You have to be worried about, then you got to start worrying about your supply chains. And so it's a lot of planning is going on right now, more so than ever occurred in the past.
I would like to put forward a question from Felix Haas. Which key developments do you think the leading countries in Southeast Asia are preparing regarding either outcome of the election?
Yeah, under either outcome of the election, the view and clearly the view in Southeast Asia is to both Washington and Beijing is, don't make us choose. We do not want to have to choose between either of you. We need both of you, and certainly from an economic perspective, there's much greater investment overall from the U.S. into Southeast Asia, but there's much greater trade between Southeast Asia in China. And so how do you make sure you keep that balance? And so that's something the governments here seem to be, very focused on. It's why when the U.S. put forth the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which a lot of people said, oh, this isn't a trade agreement. There isn't anything in there. The U.S. isn't opening up market access. Why is anybody going to spend any time on this? And yet, lo and behold, you had 14 countries, including, with the United States, including many of whom in Southeast Asia, sign up to this, negotiate with it, wanting to get the U.S. to remain engaged. And so they will continue to look for opportunities to keep the U.S. fully engaged, while they, of course, fully engage with China as well. And how they keep that balancing act going is something they're going to have to watch. It's going to be possibly easier under a Harris administration, because it's going to be having that working with partners and allies approach is going to be easier, relatively speaking, than working bilaterally. But it doesn't matter. If Trump wins, if Harris wins, governments here are going to work with the U.S. They don't have a choice.
Steve, we are watching a kind of a beginning of a multipolar world, and obviously India comes into the play, more so to say. What are you expecting of the U.S. relationship vis-a-vis India in the next coming years?
Well, certainly from a business perspective, India is, not that India can replace China anytime soon, and not in years, if not longer than that, because China is so good at what it does in terms of the investment they put in terms of the people that they have, in terms of the technologies that they have. But India is that one market where you can manufacture for a domestic market and to export. And so it's the only country really large enough for both in Asia. And so there's a lot of focus on India. That is where a lot of the companies here, I think all companies, not just American companies, but all companies looking at India. It's certainly for the same reasons from a economic and trade perspective. It is so attractive to companies. It's also attractive to governments, and certainly to the United States government. And having India in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, having India is part of the Quad, the military cooperation that you have, the U.S., Australia, Japan, and India. So bringing in India from a U.S. perspective, in a military perspective, in a trade perspective, and an investment perspective, is going to be a top priority for whichever government would be in place in the United States.
We touched upon many geopolitical developments and trends, and in the audience, we obviously have many business leaders, business people. And the question would be, what is the impact now of these global geopolitical developments and trends you just mentioned actually on the global economy in the next forthcoming couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different examples of it now. I mean, you can even give I just literally read in the Singapore media, I think it was today or yesterday, that what's happening in Bangladesh is causing a lot of there's a lot of workers from Bangladesh here, especially in construction in Singapore. They're all going home because they want to be home. I mean, they want to make sure that their families are safe. They want to be participating in what's happening now, and that's hitting the construction industry in Singapore. We're so interconnected to geopolitics now, and there's so much happening in every country that you have to keep track of. And so I used to say I worked. I've spent my career from government forward. I used to say I worked at the intersection of business and government. Now I say I work at the collision of business and government. Right? Because it's happening on trade, and you certainly saw that happen. You certainly see it happen with sanctions, so much more prevalent today. And obviously you see that primarily in Russia now, and what the cost that has had to businesses. So you have to be prepared for sanctions. What's going to happen in the Middle East if we have if a real war across multiple countries were to break out in the Middle East, and then sanctions were to be imposed? What is that going to do to you there? What's that going to do to your supply chain? And so you now have to have geopolitics front and center in terms of your strategy, in terms of risk, and in terms of your supply chain, in terms of your operations, literally in terms of everything now.
And would you say that companies are prepared for these kind of developments, or what particular advice would you have right now for companies?
No, I mean, I think they're starting certainly to prepare. Some obviously much more advanced than others. But I mean, I think one simple thing I say is you used to focus on ESG, right? So you'd look at the environment and the climate risk and climate opportunity. Obviously, the S, you'd be looking at supply chain, worker health and safety. And G, that governance would typically be, anti-corruption, full compliance, cyber security would fit in there. But now you need another G. Now it's ESGG. Now you have to take that geopolitics and throw it on top of climate. How is that going to impact everything? You have to take geopolitics and throw it on your supply chain. You have to take geopolitics and focus and throw it on how you're going to be governed and how you're going to deal with governments. And that is the framework that businesses are and investors in particular are starting to use. I think you see it a lot in the private capital sector. You see a lot of investors now, going to their GPs, their general partners, wanting to know how they are thinking through all of this. And that's, it's never too late to start, and you have to start thinking through this geopolitics now. And it's only going, sometimes, in economics, you have a bull market and a bear market, right? Well, in geopolitics, we have a bull market that is never going to end.
We have to come to an end. So my final question would be, Steve, what worries you most these days?
Well, wow. Let's see. What worries me most these days? How do you keep on top of everything? I mean, like I always, what am I missing? What's, you've got to keep on track of, certainly in the geopolitical world. It's just not okay. The U.S. is sending negotiators to China, or China sending negotiators to the U.S. and let's see what's going to happen, or what's going to happen at the WTO. I mean, you used to be able to really focus on certain specific events when you'd be doing geopolitics. Now you have to watch everything. Okay, what am I missing on climate? What am I missing on supply chain? What's going to happen in the Middle East that's going to impact us in Asia? It's just how you keep up with everything is what is. I have no idea what the answer is, other than I don't sleep as much as I should, and it's only going to get worse.
Now we have just a very final question from Stefan Repsamen, who is on the board of the Stars Foundation. I just read it. China is facing a couple of severe difficulties, like setback in exports, people paying back debts instead of spending in consumption, etc., etc. This is a toxic mix. Is the next black swan coming from China, and what would that mean for the world?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think part of the, when I was at UPS, we used to say, China is not an option; it's essential. We have to be there. You have to do business there. You have to figure out how to do business there. You have to, be fully engaged there. And I don't think that has changed. And so everything you have said in terms of the risks that are in China, and I think, property certainly is high on that list. The bad loans is high on that list. But you still have to be there, and so you still have to take that into account and figure out how. You just can't leave China. I mean, maybe a few companies have left China since COVID and since the real tensions have started, but you can't. I mean, most companies can't, and so you're right to figure out what are all those risks in China, and then how do you mitigate them by still being there, because you can't leave China. You have to be there. And the other thing is, Chinese companies are getting better all the time. You have to be there to compete with them. You can't, because if you cede the China market to them, you're soon going to be ceding your home market to them.
Looking at geopolitics, and Steve, this is really the last question. We were talking about lots of risks, and it was slightly pessimistic. So I want to end on a positive note. What hope is there if you look at geopolitics?
Well, I think I would look at the U.S. election right now. We'll bring it back to America. We have a real different campaign taking place. This is the Trump campaign. This is, make America great again, because we're not great now. I think he called the U.S. a third world country yesterday. And it's a very, in a way, dystopian campaign. And the Harris campaign, which seems to be working now, Toni, why you said she's looking good in terms of her campaign. I feel like it's a campaign of joy. It's we won't go back again. It's all about our freedoms. And if that message works in the U.S., and I think it can work across the world as well. And so that gives me some hope that we can be forward-looking, and we can look for how we're going to, provide solutions to all of these challenges. There's black swans out there. There's gray rhinos out there. But we know what they are, and we can overcome them. And so for that reason, I hope I share your optimism.
Thank you very much. Great conclusion. But time is up. We have to stop here. We have to come to an end. Orientation is needed in this, let's call it, in inverted comma, crazy world. Steve, thank you very much for your insights and analysis. I think you helped us a lot to better understand what is happening geopolitically speaking, geoeconomically speaking. So thank you very much again. Wish you all the best, and hope to have you again sooner or later at STARS events. Thank you very much. The next
Always great
webinar,
to be part of STARS. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next webinar in this series will be in exactly 1 week from now, on the 22nd of August. The speaker will be Mona Satfan. She is a strategy consultant, an expert in geopolitics and geoeconomics. She was former White House Deputy Chief of Staff in the Obama administration. I hope to see you there. Thank you very much. Goodbye and take care.